Judy.
Cool. Okay, welcome everyone to the Journal Club on natural language processing. So if you have any questions, ask at any time. Even if I'm talking, just interrupt me. There aren't any stupid questions. I'm also new to this subject, so like if it seems silly to you, it's probably what I'm thinking as well. And so if I'm also not an expert, so if I say anything wrong, please correct me. So what is natural language processing? So a lot of people assume that it's actually a technique-centered field when actually it's more domain-centered. So the techniques used in it are normally deep learning, statistical methods and stuff like that. There's no one theory of NLP. It's mainly the unifying study of AI and linguistics, and the main challenges are language generation, translation, recognition, sentiment analysis, and there's many different challenges that are faced. So the first paper I think would be an interesting one to start considering our situation. So it's a sentiment analysis in European Twitter messages during the pandemic we're currently in. It was almost, I think they're all from Germany, all the researchers that did it. So the aim was to observe the change in mood over the time period of December 2019 to April 2020, which which was when Europe was worst hit. I think it started with Italy and then it spread around. So they did this by collecting nearly 4 million, over 4 million geo-referenced tweets, and they got all this from the Twitter API. Just so you guys know, it might be beneficial if you have the paper up with you, just so you can follow along with what I'm saying, especially with the later papers, which get quite extensive. So to do this, okay, let's start with this. Yeah, the tweets by country. So there's obviously a lot more tweets from the UK, and maybe that could be cultural reasons that we use Twitter more than other countries. If you can't read the smaller countries, let me know. I will zoom in on my iPad and read them out. So down here, it's Estonia, Republic of Macedonia, Luxembourg, Lithuania, Malta, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Can you all see these ones here that I'm circling? Yeah, okay, cool. So, sorry guys, one sec. There we go. So for automatic sentiment analysis, I use the neural network. So that's mainly deep learning, if you guys don't already know. So how that works is it's essentially layered steps of learning. If I'm assuming everyone already knows a little bit about how machine learning works, is you're trying to find a function that maps input into an output that has a meaningful representation. So it was trained on what is called sentiment 140, and in NLP there's a lot of already trained models which other researchers use instead of creating their own. It's a way of saving time. And also it means that you can use the data you want to use purely for testing rather than wasting some of it on training and validation. So this is an example of the model. So the embedding model is the one I just mentioned where it's a pre-trained model. And then it's passed into this fully connected layer. ReLU here, if you don't know, is an activation function. Similar if you do neuroscience, similar to how stuff is activated in your brain. And then it's output as a sentiment value between 0 and 1, 1 being positive, 0.5 being neutral, and 0 being a negative sentiment. So variants of the models were tested on pre-trained word and sentence level embeddings. So that was from this Muse before, yeah. And the weight in this Muse model were frozen because they didn't want it to over adapt to English, especially because most of the tweets were from the UK. So this is the mean squared error loss. If you don't already know what that is, it's often in machine learning, you want to test on the loss rather than the accuracy, because the accuracy, you could be off by 0.5, but because it rounds up, you're going to get an accuracy mark of a higher one than if it's just the loss in general. And as you can see, the Muse loss was a lot lower. So that's why that was used as the embedding model. So these are some of the assumptions that were made, which can all be questioned in terms of the model. So this one here that I'm pointing to is one I think is the most important, because sentiment is subjective. The model can't notice if we're being sarcastic or something like that. So that is probably the best criticism of sentiment analysis, but they can all be adequately questioned. So what they found was, I'm going to show you the graph first, I think. Yeah. So the yellowy green one was just sentiment over time. That was not in regards to people tweeting about COVID. That was just general sentiment. So you can see that dipped around here in March, which I believe was a lockdown announcement, and slowly went up a little bit. But as you can see over time, it generally decreased across all countries. And then with the keywords, so the keywords they use, I believe if you've got the paper up, are Corona, COVID, Wuhan, Karuna, and then Corona in other languages and stuff like that. So the ones with the keywords significantly dropped, as you can see, which is kind of interesting. It means before January, people were talking about COVID in probably more of a statistical way rather than, oh, I'm upset about COVID, I'm upset about lockdowns, etc. But you can also see that it slowly went up. And then these were the results across countries. As you can see, Germany just generally has a lower sentiment, even though they have actually fewer cases compared to the other countries. And there's consistent dips around, that was when the first lockdown was announced. But then they all actually went up, which the assumption is obviously that people kind of got used to the situation, they adjusted, they got a bit better, but they still didn't go back up to pre-COVID levels. So I'll go back to this slide. Yeah, so that's basically what, that's basically just what I said in regards to the graphs. So in general, there is a downward trend in sentiment, and there's clear sentiment dips during the lockdown announcements, but recovery over time. One thing that's interesting to notice is that the UK, sorry, it's the grey one, it dips, but it does not rise back as much as the other ones. So this could also be to do with potentially how our government handled it. I know this seems to be more unhappiness with how we did that, but it's interesting how just using sentiment analysis on tweets can find these things out. So other work in similar things was they analyzed sentiment in tweets in the USA, and it produced similar results, but it also noticed, it also investigated the political change and how people were reacting to like anti-masks and anti-lockdowns, and they associated it with user profiles. So you could find out like from these tweets about their sentiment towards COVID, what political party they supported and stuff like that. So yeah, I hope that was okay. Here are some discussion questions. If any of you have any idea of how to maybe approach these, if you guys have any ideas based on what I just said, based on if you read the paper, feel free to unmute to talk about it. That'd be great.
I was quite interested in the first place in why they might have been so restrictive of the keywords. Like,
oh yeah,
right? Because they probably could have used like virus or lockdown or quarantine to get a larger pool of results that actually were pertinent to COVID itself. So why do you think they might have been restrictive?
I don't know, because I'm looking at them right now and there's maybe 20 words on the keywords list. Maybe because virus is too broad that it wouldn't be specific enough to corona. So that's the only thing I could really think of. Otherwise, I'm not sure why they wouldn't use more than that.
Hi. I have two questions. Wait, let me find my mouse. I wrote them down. Okay. So first of all, why did they use the Twitter API? Why didn't they scrap it themselves? Because the Twitter API is very, very severely limited.
Well, actually, so do you mean why they didn't do like a survey?
No. So basically, like you can get tweets from Twitter in two ways. First is by using the official Twitter API, which is severely limited. It's very expensive and stuff like that. So basically there is constraints such as that, for instance, if I recall correctly, you can only use the last week or so of tweets, and there is like limited amount of tweets that you can get. And yes, it's not such limitations. And like the second way is just to scrap the website.
Well, in terms of the limitations of the API, I wasn't aware that there were so many limitations. I didn't know that. But when I was reading it, I did notice that they were taking the tweets every single week. So that limitation of you can only take tweets every week, I guess is resolved because they were doing it every week. But other than that, I wasn't aware that it was so limited. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to find the exact limits on like Twitter
Yeah, no problem.
API website, but right now I can't find them. But yeah, it's heavily constrained.
Okay.
And kind of the second question might come from me. I don't know if I understand it correctly, but for such tasks as, for instance, like sentiment analysis, wouldn't it make more sense that transformers would deliver better results than just a fully connected dense layer? Like, for instance, wouldn't fine-tuning BERT or something similar produce better results?
That is a good point.
Because like they mentioned that in the embedding part, the embedding layer performed better. But like, if I recall correctly, when BERT was released, it was considered state of the art for a couple of NLP exercises, such as questions and answering. And if I again recall correctly, it was also like the sentiment analysis. But I'm gonna have to look for it. Right?
Yeah, I don't know much about transformers. I have heard that they are good in terms of this. Let me have a look. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't know if anyone else has any input as to why they might have used this rather than transformers. Don't know if there's anyone from machine learning that came in or not. No. Anyone else have any questions?
I think Rishi just posted one in the chat.
Oh, okay, I can't see the chat, so if you could read that out, that would be good. Or I can stop sharing to see it.
Oh.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well. No, that's fine. Yeah, I thought that as well when I read it, like, especially because a lot of the tweets came from the UK. It could just be a culture of tweeting. So there's probably a lot of countries where the culture isn't so much around Twitter, and different cultural factors can affect why someone might be tweeting negatively or not. And for example, Germany's low sentiment, that was low right at the beginning before they even had a lot of cases. So that was assumed to be also to cultural factors. So yeah, hope that answers your question. Any other questions? You don't have to just talk to me. You can also talk to each other if you want. I realize it's a bit weird to do that on Zoom, but yeah.
If this is a if this is a convenient point, I'd be interested to hear from Marek earlier about the question on transformers, on why the transformers would be better, and perhaps you could give everybody an introduction to transformers.
Okay, so like why transformers might be better is that I just found a research paper from this year saying that like for sentiment analysis, out of the architectures they looked into, BERT actually, which is a bidirectional transformer, worked best. I can like share a link in the chat. But as for like explaining how exactly they work, I would have to prepare. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you for sharing the link. That would be good. If there's no more questions, I can move on to the next paper if everyone's ready. Yeah. Okay, so the next paper was a survey of multilingual neural machine translation. This paper was quite, I don't know how many of you looked at it, but it was quite a long paper. So I have, for time's sake, I have skipped over some of the points that I felt were slightly less relevant to NLP, and some of it is a little bit more relevant to machine learning actual techniques rather than NLP, which isn't really the discussion of the club today. So their aims were to determine which approaches to multilingual neural machine translation are the most promising for the field. So there's various different approaches, and this is on their use case, how much data there is basically on the different languages, how the modeling is done, challenges, etc., etc. And so they also address the strengths, weaknesses, and they determine future direction. So I quite like surveys because they give quite an overview of the field, so you can get quite a lot of information. I would recommend reading the whole thing at some point. It is quite long and there's a lot of information in it, but it's an interesting paper. So the overview of neural machine translation is it's what Google Translate uses, but that's a one-to-one. And multilingual machine translation, what that's trying to do is to be able to translate one to many or many to one, so that you have language pairs is like English to Spanish, Catalan to English. And so in this example with a resource poor language, that would be like Catalan to English. There's not a lot of data in regards to translating those, whereas between Spanish there is. So that's what's called a high resource language. So the points here are the different ways that neural machine translation can help in all sorts of translation problems. And this is an important one for maybe like tech and business, because it's much more easy to put it into phones. It's a lot more compact. You can put it into phones, Internet of Things and stuff like that. Okay, I'm just gonna go over the maths really. This is the easy bit of the maths, and it's the only bit of maths I'm gonna go over. So the Y is the translation, and then the X is the input, and this is the probability that you'll get the translation given the input sentence, and then this is a parameter, right? So all this is saying is that your probability of receiving this translation given this input sentence is, well, this is the maximum log likelihood loss, but just the Py given X and theta is the probability of getting that translation. And then this is just a way of maximizing the likelihood of receiving that probability. So if you don't get this math, that's okay, but I hope you get the idea of what I just said. Okay, so this is the first type of MNT that they go over. So this is trying to support multiple translations between multiple different languages, and it's believed that transfer learning between languages can help improve the overall translation quality and enable translation between language pairs that don't have any data at all. So recent research has been on trying to understand it from a linguistic point of view, which for me is probably the most interesting part. There was someone who is from linguistics here, I think. So if she has any input towards the end, that would be great. No pressure or anything. So a central task is aligning word and sentence representations across languages so that divergence between languages can be bridged. I think this also extends to like in some languages, there are words that have meanings that don't exist in other languages. So that's something I find quite interesting. You can't have direct translations. So a lot of studies have been on the vocabulary and about multilingual representations in different, that's the goals of a lot of different research papers. As I said before, I think I mentioned that it's helpful for low resource languages where there's not a lot of corpora data. So for example, I used English to Spanish and English to Catalan. So in this case, the parent language would be English to Spanish and the child language would be English to Catalan. And using what we know about English to Spanish, you're able to get information about translating between English to Catalan. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Catalan and Spanish are somewhat similar. So that also makes it easier. And that's in regards to this language relatedness. So a lot of research has been done on lexical and syntactic transfer between the languages and translation to accurately be able to do that. And it's been shown in a lot of research that language relatedness actually helps. I mean, it's not really surprising if you think about it, but language relatedness helps with this translation. So, for example, with the Spanish and the Catalan. So for unseen language pairs, so this could be for example, quite unknown languages. So for example, tribal languages spoken in Papua New Guinea, where they have very little contact with humans from the rest of the world. There's little understanding between that language and translating it to other languages. But if you have a language that is shared, so let's say you can translate from English to a native language that's in Australia, to the native people in Australia, then that language is more similar to the language spoken in Papua New Guinea. And with that pivot language, you're able to translate between them. So a lot of research is done on translating between two languages and the pivot language. I think that's quite an interesting point of view. I mean, in regards to other pivot languages, the pivot language is usually English, because it's so widely spread and so widely spoken. So most languages are able to be translated into English in general. And then multi-source NMT is when a language has already been translated into many other. This can be used to understand a lot of linguistic phenomena. So the two most recent works are on European languages. So like, languages spoken in the EU are often, they actually use a multi-source NMT to translate when they're in the EU, when I think it's called a conference, when they're having a conference about EU laws, etc. They use one of these models to translate to all the languages that are in the room. And the same thing with the UN, they use a similar model. If you open the paper, they have quite an extensive section on future directions, because obviously they've evaluated all that's already been done. And I think one thing that could be quite interesting is in language representation learning, they've spoken about addressing code switching and dialects. So for example, even in just the UK, there's Cockney slang, there's Northern slang. I'm not sure how well these kind of models will be able to distinguish between those types of different dialects, especially with Cockney rhyming slang. I personally don't know it very well, and I don't always know what people are saying, but that's just one example. So in conclusion, these models can vastly improve machine translation quality and distributivity of using these models in technology and devices, and it can improve the understanding of the relationships between languages and the linguistics of the languages, and understanding how some words could mean one thing in this language but don't have a direct meaning in another. But they did say that one problem was that it lacks a lot of human evaluation on the models. So that is something that needs to be done in order to determine how well they're actually working, if they're working in a way that can be compared to how humans understand language. Okay, time for discussion. If any of you wanted to say anything on that, or if anyone from linguistics had anything to say, that would be quite good.
Yeah, so I do linguistics.
Okay,
and
great.
I was just wondering, I was honestly more wondering why, instead of using like between the Spanish and Catalan, why use English and why not just do general principles of universal grammar? Because although for Spanish and Catalan, they're quite like well connected in English because they're all Indo-European, and although English has gone into the Germanic side of languages and Spanish into Romance, yeah, they're similar, there's language contact. But say we take your example of, I'm not very familiar with indigenous languages in Australia, but let's take, I'm familiar with Cachical, which is a Guatemalan language, and it's in a Mayan family tree, so it's completely different. And if we take another Mayan language and then use English as a pivot as the overall language we were discussing, there are so many syntactic features within those two languages, within the Kachka one and the other Mayan language, that just aren't available in English at all.
So do you mean, sorry, go on, keep going.
No, you can go.
I was going to say, do you mean syntactic transfer? Oh, sorry. So do you mean that there's so much in other languages that isn't in English that a lot would be lost if you use English as the pivot language? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's definitely something that needs to be considered in the research, that English isn't this overall amazing language that can just solve everything in terms of translation, because it can't hold a lot of meaning for a lot of languages. I mean, I know even translating books, you kind of lose a meaning once you've translated it from a different language. Does that answer your question?
A bit, yeah.
I mean, I don't know enough about the field as to why they don't just kind of ignore English altogether. I mean, I'm sure they use other languages as the pivot language. They just often have to use English, if that makes sense.
I'm just trying to understand how much do they use of the English? Is it just kind of more surface stuff, or are they actually going into the deep syntactic and phonological information? Or is it literally like this like base level thing?
I mean, I think they do go into like the lexicon and the syntax. I don't know how deeply they go into. This is the first paper I've ever read on it. But I don't think it's completely surface level. I don't know if it's as deep as trying to translate every single little thing. Sorry, I don't know enough to answer your question. I don't know if anyone else knows in the group that could answer.
Can I butt in for?
Yeah, go ahead.
I did some work on the subject. So a lot of the approaches make use of word embeddings. Have you heard of word embeddings before? No, okay. So these are like vectors that are taught in a way such that similar vectors represent semantically similar things, such that, for example, like like the vector for like and the vector for love, like each individual word has a vector, are quite similar together, right? So the issue with word embedding these vectors that they don't contain any of the sort of like morphological or lexical nature of the words. There have been work that is trying to incorporate that into the actual vectors, but at least in the context that I've seen this is they use English, because the more data you have for a particular language, the better the quality of these vectors. And English is obviously the language that there's most of out there on the internet and has most parallel corpora to other languages. But your point is incredibly valid. Like for example, Chinese to English translations are very often like very bad, and we don't have proper automated ways to translate. So if you're trying to translate from Chinese to Japanese, for example, having to go through English is a very big issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just think it's about, from how you've discussed, like, and the presentation as well, it just seems that like the translation and the machine, and maybe it's just how it's coded, it's not taking in all the syntactic information. And by that, I mean the actual syntactic structure. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen syntax trees and stuff. Like, there's this hierarchical structure to language that every single language shares. It's the underlying thing. So when you see these trees, languages become really, really similar because it's the same structures. They're just slightly different. They're tweaked depending on the speaker's native language, sorry. So what I'm trying to say is that if these machines, like, I just think it would be easier, instead of doing this translation of English at the top and then to other language, you just put these structures in, if that makes sense, because then you're only got to change a few things, and then the lexicon then becomes an issue of implementing lexicon, but then you have the syntactic structure in, if that makes sense to anyone.
I mean, I don't know about linguistics the way you do. I think the only thing I can imagine is it's an issue of data size. That's the only thing I can think it would be, is that it would be hard to encode the data you're talking about, and you can't do any of any of NLP without like a significant amount of data. Like with the tweets, it was 4.5 million tweets to get anything meaningful out of. But your point is completely valid. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that might be a thing. I think I'm going way too like linguistic theory.
No. That's what we want, discussion. So it's good.
Yeah, I just wanted to cut in there and say, sorry, I'm really new to all of this, so that's why I'm kind of taking a back seat right now and just really enjoying listening to other people. But is this what you were saying there? I mean, is it worth, I would reach out to, because what you're saying sounds really interesting, and a really good point, that perhaps you can reach out to the authors of the paper and ask for more details about that, and if that isn't something that they've considered, maybe that is something for future directions that could be considered, because at least for me, I mean, yeah, like I said, I'm a complete novice with this, but that sounds like a very important consideration, and yeah, so maybe it is something that's worth, because you obviously know more about it from the linguistic side. I don't know about these authors if they didn't have that background knowledge. Yeah, maybe you could reach out to them and ask.
Maybe like I would be really interested in that, because all I've got is like the linguistic side, the more NLP coding side, technology side, just a little bit over my head. But thank you for that suggestion.
There is an NLP group at UCL, and I'm sure if you emailed them, they'd reply. So even just asking them, how come this isn't used in general in translation, I'm sure they would give you a response.
Yeah, thank you for telling me that. I didn't know about that group.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else have any questions or anything they want to ask or talk about? If not, then I'll move on to the next paper. Okay, so this paper was to decompose questions, very complex or more complex questions, into sub-questions so that they're more easily answered. So in ML, it's called QA if you're talking about a question answering model. And by decomposing harder questions into simpler sub-questions, each of those sub-questions can then be answered, and then they can all be recomposed into one big long answer. If you guys have the paper up, I believe they give an example to show, which I think was a good example. Sorry, bear with me. Yeah, so what profession do H.L. Mencken and Albert Camus have in common? And so it splits up into who Albert Camus was and who H.L. Mencken was. And then by answering those two questions, they're put back together and you've got one longer answer. So in this paper, if you've read it, they refer to single hop questions as questions which require only one paragraph or one piece of evidence to answer. And then the harder, more complex questions are called multi-hop. So I think it's just a term they like to use, and hop just means kind of like go to one and come back. And so this is why it's called single, and that's why it's called multi. So it maps a question into sub-questions in an unsupervised learning way. So that means, if you're not familiar, supervised is if it's labeled, unsupervised if it's not labeled, and learns the probability distribution on its own. Then it finds the sub-answers with the single hop QA model, which is a pre-trained model that they end up using. And then they use the sub-questions and sub-answers to predict A without any subscript to answer Q, which was the first more complex question. So they had to have access to hard questions. So they call it hard question corpus Q and simple question corpus S, and this was used in training. I believe they used another word embedding model to begin with, which is what they also did in the other paper. So as I said, a lot in NLP, they tend to use pre-trained models to save the data so that they don't waste the data they want to learn about on training. So to answer the generated sub-questions, they use an off-the-shelf QA model, like I just mentioned, and it answers the questions using any free form of text. So any type of text you can think of, word, phrase, sentence, paragraph. Usually it won't be longer than a sentence just because they're answering simple questions, but then the recomposed answer at the end could be a longer paragraph because it's obviously putting potentially multiple sentences together. So learning to recompose was when the model is trained, it's trained not only on the model to get sub-questions, but it's also trained to recompose. So this is also using a pre-trained model to do this part. So it's beneficial to have a large data sample because I don't know if you guys know what mining is. I realized maybe I should have explained what mining is, but mining is essentially when you use machine learning and other computing techniques to get a large amount of data that's normally freely available on the internet. So that's often how they do it. So this Squad 2 and Hot Pot QA are the initial data that they found just online. So these are big data sets used for the, as I said, single hop and multi-hop questions to be able to train the model on finding answers and then recomposing. And as you can see, using mining, they had many, many more samples to train on, from 130K to 10.1 million, and from 90K to 2.4 million for the more complex questions. So as part of the model training, they created pseudo decompositions. And so these were just fake sub-questions. I use fake loosely, but fake sub-questions and fake sub-answers. And this was used for comparison purposes with random pseudo decomposition as a baseline. And this was done so that when, let me know if I'm not explaining this properly because I didn't fully understand it when I read it, but they're creating the fake ones in a sort of the same way you use training data in any normal other model. So they use different types of data to do this. So this is another sequence to sequencing model. Sorry. So this is another sequencing model. This is another model that they got from online from it's already a pre-trained model. So you can see that's quite a pattern in NLP to use already trained models as a form of not wasting your time. So they use sequence to sequence and they use onus, and both of them were fine-tuned to their model. And I think they ended up saying that onus was better, but we'll see when we get to the results. So yeah, so for the single hop, they used, I've referenced it here if you guys want to have a look at it, but it's also in the paper. They pre-trained, used this model for the training of the simple question and answer model. And then it takes in several paragraphs and questions to predict the answer, and it learns to predict either it will say, oh, this is the answer, or it will say, we can't find an answer. And it does this by also mining, I believe. So if you give it a question like, who is Donald Trump, it will go to the internet and it will Google Donald Trump on its own. I believe this is part of mining. But if you have read the paper, do let me know if I'm getting this wrong. So in the recomposition part of the model, each sub-question and some answer pair is appended to the original question, if that makes sense. So say I've asked one complicated question, then all the way it's been broken down into these sub-questions, sub-answers are still appended to my original question. So from the results, they realized that both pseudo decomposition and the onus, which is the original pre-trained model, contribute to the decomposition quality. On the paper, if you can look at the table on page So on page 6, you can see that the accuracy increases on all these types of subcategories of questions. So on bridge, intersection, comparison, and single hop, the accuracy goes up by, the smallest increase in percentage was 1%, and then the highest increase of percentage was nearly 8%. So pseudo decomposition worked on all of the models, and so did onus. I might not even be saying onus right, it might be ONUS, so correct me on that if I'm wrong. And the quality of the sub answers is also crucial for improving question answering models. So if you're not training it on a very good original model that already exists, you're not going to improve the model at all. So it's quite important which model you pick originally to train on. So when evaluated on Hotpot QA, this approach significantly improved QA over other models that did not use decomposition, which means that for QA models in the future, decomposition is likely to be the best way to answer very complex questions if you're trying to get a computer to answer these questions. And it opens up exciting avenues for all sorts of domains in which might use question and answering. So one I was thinking of was in healthcare. It could be quite a big place to use question and answering models when people are asking, oh, I have this symptom and this symptom and this symptom and this symptom. What do I have? I think this could be a good application of it. So we come to the end of that paper, and that was also the last paper. So while you consider any questions you might have, I was wondering if anyone has any input on how the different domains that we've talked about could be used together, if anyone can think of anything. Anyone? So my idea was health for the question and answering. And in terms of combining them, I think the sentiment analysis with the multilingual machine translation could be interesting if we wanted to find out how sentiment is changing across the globe and not just in Europe. And if those could be used together, you could get from pretty much every single country you could think of. Don't know if anyone else wants to say anything. You can ask questions if I didn't explain something properly either, not just if you want to discuss. Okay, no problem if there's no questions. Hopefully that means I explained it okay. But yeah, thank you guys for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I would appreciate feedback. I haven't done a talk like this before. So please tell me how I could improve it. If you have any advice for me, that would be great. And I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll come to the next one. The next one is the week after reading week. It will be on fairness, I believe. So yeah, that one I know more than NLP, so hopefully I can answer some more questions. So, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much for hosting.
Hope it was enjoyable.
For anybody that wants, we will be posting the full video of the recording on the website, which you should all have access to. It's just uclaisociety.com.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Akina.